The sound of cracking would split the air, followed by a heavy thud that vibrated through the ground. My sister, Emily, was frozen in her wheelchair on the porch, her face pale with disbelief. Before us, a cloud of dust rose from the ruins of the wooden ramp, a ramp that had just been standing there minutes ago. A yellow bulldozer rumbled in neutral, its engine growling like some predatory beast. The driver, a stocky man in a reflective vest, casually wiped his forehead, oblivious to the storm he had just unleashed. Next to him stood Mr. Calloway, the head of our neighborhood's HOA, arms folded smugly across his chest. "I told you," Calloway said, smirking. "Non-compliant structures get removed. HOA rules are rules." Emily's hands clenched the armrests of her wheelchair. My sister wasn't just anyone. She was a federal prosecutor, a relentless one at that. The kind of person who put corporate criminals and gang leaders behind bars for a living. And right now, her expression wasn't just shock. It was cold, simmering fury. "You just made the worst mistake of your life," Emily said, her voice deadly calm. Calloway chuckled, completely misreading the situation. "Is that so?" Emily's jaw tightened, but she didn't yell. She didn't argue. She just pulled out her phone, her fingers tapping swiftly. "Enjoy your lawsuit," she said. Calloway's smirk faltered slightly, but before he could say another word, Emily turned the screen toward him. His face drained of color. The HOA had messed with the wrong person. 2 weeks earlier, none of this had happened. The ramp was still standing. The neighborhood was peaceful, or at least, it seemed that way. We had just moved into this suburban community, a place that promised safety, comfort, and a strong sense of community. But what we didn't know was that beneath the manicured lawns and friendly smiles, there was a silent war. A war against outsiders. Emily and I had grown up in a city where no one cared who you were, as long as you minded your business. But here, people had an opinion about everything, especially about us. The first sign of trouble came as soon as the ramp was installed. It was a simple structure, built so Emily could enter and exit the house easily. The house was technically accessible, but the single step leading to the front door made it impossible for her to navigate alone. So we did what any reasonable family would do. We hired a contractor, got it built, and thought nothing more of it. Until the letter arrived. The HOA's official seal was stamped in the corner, and the language was laced with that passive-aggressive politeness that made my stomach turn. "Dear homeowner, your recent construction is in violation of the neighborhood's architectural compliance standards. Please remove the unauthorized structure within 14 days or face penalties." I had scoffed. They can't be serious. But Emily had only sighed, already bracing herself. "They're serious," she said. "HOAs always are." Still, she wasn't too worried. She dealt with red tape and stubborn bureaucrats for a living. A simple conversation would clear this up. At least, that's what we thought. Emily sent a polite email explaining the necessity of the ramp and citing the Americans with Disabilities Act. When that was ignored, she followed up with another. And another. Then a phone call. Then 2. Every single time, she was met with silence. Then, one day, a note was taped to our door. "Last warning. Remove the structure or action will be taken." The message was clear. But what the HOA didn't understand was that Emily didn't back down. Ever. What they did next. That was what turned this from a petty HOA dispute into a full-blown legal war. And they had no idea who they were up against. The day before the demolition, I caught a glimpse of what was coming, though I didn't recognize it at the time. It was early morning, and I was heading out to get coffee when I saw 2 men in dark polo shirts pacing in front of our house, eyeing the ramp like it was some sort of eyesore. One of them was on his phone, nodding every few seconds, while the other took pictures. Something about the way they moved, like they had already made a decision, sent a chill up my spine. I approached them, trying to keep my tone neutral. "Can I help you?" The man with the phone glanced at me, then back at the ramp. "Just doing an inspection. HOA business." Inspection? That was the first I'd heard of it. "I don't remember anyone scheduling an inspection," I said. He gave me a tight smile. "We don't have to schedule it. This is a compliance matter." A compliance matter. That was HOA speak for "we don't like what you did, so we're going to flex our power." I bit back my frustration. If this is about the ramp, my sister already explained. We're aware, he interrupted. But the rules are the rules. Unauthorized structures must be removed. I exhaled slowly, trying to keep my anger in check. It's a wheelchair ramp. He shrugged like that detail didn't matter. Still an unauthorized structure. Emily had told me this neighborhood had a problem. But until that moment, I hadn't fully grasped how deep it ran. This wasn't just about aesthetics or some outdated rule. This was about control. The men finished taking their pictures and walked away without another word. I watched them go, a pit forming in my stomach. I should have told Emily immediately. Should have warned her. Instead, I let it go, assuming we had time. I was wrong. The next morning, we woke up to the sound of a truck pulling up in front of the house. By the time I made it outside, it was already too late. The demolition crew worked fast. Too fast. It was clear they had come with one goal: destroy and leave. A few neighbors watched from their porches, some whispering, others pretending they weren't interested. No one stepped in. No one objected. Emily rolled onto the porch just as the final support beam was yanked out. She didn't shout, didn't scream. She just sat there, gripping the wheels of her chair so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Then she pulled out her phone and started recording. "You just destroyed an accessibility ramp," she said, her voice calm but firm. Calloway, who had been supervising with an air of self-importance, turned to face her. "We gave you multiple warnings. And you ignored every single one of my attempts to communicate," Emily shot back. Calloway crossed his arms. "It was a violation." Emily smirked. It wasn't a pleasant smirk. It was the kind that made grown men in courtrooms shift uncomfortably. "That's interesting," she said, "because I just got off the phone with the ADA's legal division." The color drained from Calloway's face. "You broke federal law," Emily continued. "And I hope you have a good attorney, because you're going to need one." For the first time since this ridiculous battle started, Calloway looked unsure of himself. And that's when I realized he had no idea who my sister really was. He thought he was dealing with just another homeowner. He had no clue that Emily had spent her entire career tearing apart people exactly like him. People who thought they could get away with anything. Calloway opened his mouth, then closed it, his confidence flickering like a faulty light bulb. He shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable under Emily's stare. "Listen," he finally said, voice less smug than before. "There's no need to get lawyers involved. I'm sure we can work something out." Emily arched an eyebrow. "You bulldozed my ramp without due process. You think I'm just going to work something out?" Calloway hesitated, then gestured toward the demolition crew. "Look, it's not personal. The HOA has standards, and we enforce them equally. If we made an exception for you, we'd have to make an exception for everyone." Emily let out a cold, humorless laugh. "That's the line you're going with?" Calloway stiffened. "Because I did my research," she continued. "I looked at every HOA-approved modification in this neighborhood. Let's see, 6 houses have extended driveways that weren't part of the original property plan. 5 homes added decorative fences that exceed the height limit in your handbook. And, oh, my personal favorite, your house has a front porch extension that was never on the original blueprint." Calloway's jaw clenched. "Tell me," Emily went on, tilting her head, "did you bulldoze those? Or was my ramp the only one that needed immediate, aggressive enforcement?" Silence. The few neighbors who had been watching were now whispering among themselves. A couple of them glanced at Calloway with wary expressions. I don't have to explain myself to you," Calloway snapped, his previous confidence replaced by something more desperate. Emily leaned back in her wheelchair, smiling like a shark that smelled blood. "That's fine," she said, lifting her phone. "You can explain it to a judge instead." Calloway's eyes flickered to the screen, and I could practically hear the gears turning in his head. He was finally realizing how bad this looked. The HOA hadn't just violated our rights. They had violated federal law. And now, there was evidence. That night, Emily didn't sleep. While I paced the house, fuming over what had happened, she sat at the dining table with her laptop, typing with the kind of focus that meant someone was about to get legally obliterated. "You're really going through with this?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Emily didn't even look up. "Of course." I dragged a hand through my hair. "I mean, we could move. Just leave all this behind." Emily stopped typing, looked at me. "This isn't just about us," she said. "It's about everyone who gets bullied by these power-hungry HOAs. They think they're untouchable. It's time someone reminds them they aren't." I sighed. "And that someone is you?" She smirked. "It usually is." I shook my head, but deep down, I was relieved. Because if there was one thing I knew for certain, it was this. The HOA had started a war they weren't prepared to fight. And they had already lost. The next morning, Emily was already dressed and ready by the time I made it to the kitchen. She had that look, the one that meant she was in full prosecutor mode. Her laptop was open, emails sent, documents filed. I spotted a printed-out copy of the Americans with Disabilities Act sitting on the counter, sections highlighted in neon yellow. I poured myself a coffee, eyeing her carefully. "So, what's the plan?" Emily took a sip of her tea, completely calm. "I sent a formal complaint to the Department of Justice. The ADA violations alone are enough to put the HOA in serious legal trouble." I raised my eyebrows. "And Calloway?" She smirked. "Oh, Calloway is about to have the worst day of his life." I didn't doubt it. Right on cue, the doorbell rang. Emily rolled to the door, her back straight, her expression unreadable. I followed behind, my stomach twisting with anticipation. When she opened it, Calloway stood on the porch, flanked by 2 HOA board members. He had the expression of a man who had been up all night trying to figure out how to save himself. "Ms. Harper," he started, his voice strained, "I think we may have gotten off on the wrong foot." Emily's lips curled into a slow, deliberate smile. "Oh, that's funny, because I think you got off on a bulldozer." Calloway flinched. One of the board members, a thin woman with graying hair, stepped forward. "Listen," she said in a softer tone, "we understand that this was a miscommunication." I scoffed. "You call demolishing a wheelchair ramp a miscommunication?" "We don't want this to escalate," she continued. "Perhaps there's a way to resolve this privately." Emily leaned forward slightly. "You mean before the lawsuit?" Calloway cleared his throat, clearly trying to regain some control. "There's no need for that. If you rebuild the ramp using HOA-approved materials and go through the proper channels, we can grant you an exception." Emily didn't even blink. "No." Calloway frowned. "No. You had every opportunity to work with us before you sent a demolition crew to my house," she said. "You ignored every email, every phone call. You deliberately violated federal law. And now, you want me to ask for permission." Calloway opened his mouth to argue, but Emily held up a hand. "I don't need your approval," she said. "I need accountability." Silence. The board members shifted uncomfortably. "Here's what's going to happen," Emily continued. "I'm filing a lawsuit against the HOA for ADA violations and property destruction. I've also contacted the local news, so by the end of the day, everyone in the city will know exactly what you did." Calloway's face turned a deep shade of red. "You're making a mistake." Emily's smile didn't waver. "No, you did." He exhaled sharply, then turned on his heel and stormed off the porch, his board members scrambling to keep up. As they disappeared down the street, I let out a low whistle. "Well, that went well." Emily sipped her tea. "It's just the beginning." And she was right. Because by that evening, our story was on the news. Hey everyone, real quick, what would you have done in our situation? Have you ever dealt with an HOA like this? Drop a comment below and let us know. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more crazy stories. By the time the segment aired, our phones were blowing up. Friends, co-workers, even strangers were reaching out, offering support. But the best part? The HOA was now under public scrutiny, and they were about to regret everything. The fallout was immediate. By noon the next day, the news story had been shared across social media, gaining traction faster than any of us expected. Local disability advocacy groups had picked it up, and the HOA's email inbox was reportedly flooded with complaints. Then came the real kicker, an email from a civil rights attorney who had seen the story and wanted to help. Emily barely looked surprised when she read it out loud. "Looks like we have some heavy legal backing." I grinned. "Think Calloway's sweating yet?" As if on cue, the doorbell rang. We exchanged glances before Emily rolled to the door, her expression cool and unreadable. When she opened it, there stood Calloway, alone this time. And now, he looked less like a smug HOA president and more like a man whose entire world was caving in. "Ms. Harper," he stuttered, clearing his throat. "Can we talk?" Emily didn't move. "Talk about what?" He exhaled sharply. "Look, I understand you're upset." "Upset?" Emily cut in, raising an eyebrow. "You sent a bulldozer to my house, destroyed my property, and violated federal law. Upset isn't exactly the word I'd use." Calloway's jaw tightened, but he forced a smile. "I've spoken with the rest of the HOA board. We may have acted too quickly." I nearly laughed at the way he phrased it, like this was just a minor misunderstanding instead of the legal disaster it had become. "We'd like to resolve this without involving lawyers," Calloway continued. "We can approve the ramp reconstruction, no additional permits required. And, we'd be willing to cover the costs." Emily let out a soft chuckle, shaking her head. Calloway frowned. "What? You still don't get it," Emily said. "This isn't about my ramp anymore. This is about what you and your HOA think you can get away with." Calloway's patience was clearly wearing thin. "So what do you want?" Emily leaned forward slightly. "I want a formal, public apology. I want the HOA to implement new policies that comply with federal accessibility laws. And I want every single fine or penalty you've issued under these kinds of rules to be reviewed, because something tells me I'm not the only person you've bullied." Calloway's face turned red. "That's unreasonable." Emily just smiled. "Then I guess I'll see you in court." For a moment, he just stood there, his fists clenched at his sides. Then, without another word, he spun on his heel and walked away. As soon as he was gone, I turned to Emily. "You think he'll cave?" "Oh, he will," she said, rolling back inside. "Because what Calloway's really afraid of isn't me. It's losing control." And she was right. Because by the next morning, the entire HOA board was in full-blown panic mode. And they weren't the only ones. The HOA wasn't just facing a lawsuit now, they were facing a full-scale public relations disaster. News outlets started digging into their history, and what they found wasn't pretty. Turns out, our situation wasn't the first time the HOA had gone after homeowners unfairly. There were stories of elderly residents being fined thousands of dollars over minor lawn decorations, veterans forced to remove disability modifications from their homes, and families harassed over trivial violations. The HOA had built its power on intimidation. But now, that power was crumbling. And Calloway knew it. By the time the weekend rolled around, we received another official letter from the HOA. But this time, it wasn't a threat. It was a meeting request. "They want to discuss mutual resolution," Emily read, smirking as she handed me the letter. Translation: "They're desperate." I leaned against the counter. "You gonna meet with them?" She shrugged. "Might be fun to watch them sweat in person." The next morning, we arrived at the HOA's clubhouse, a pristine, overly polished building that felt more like a corporate office than part of a neighborhood. Inside, Calloway sat at the head of a long conference table, flanked by 3 board members. They looked exhausted. Emily rolled into the room with the confidence of someone who knew she was in control. I followed, folding my arms as we took our seats. Calloway cleared his throat. "Ms. Harper, we appreciate you taking the time to—" "I don't have time for pleasantries," Emily interrupted. "You called this meeting. Start talking." One of the board members, a man in his 60s with graying hair, leaned forward. "We've decided to approve the ramp reconstruction. No additional requirements, no penalties." Emily didn't react. "And—" The man hesitated. "And we'll issue an apology." I watched as Calloway stiffened, clearly hating that part. Emily tapped her fingers on the table. Public or private? The board members exchanged glances. Private, Calloway said. This isn't something we need to make a spectacle out of. Emily laughed, a short, sharp laugh that made everyone in the room shift uncomfortably. No, she said. You don't get to do this in the dark. You humiliated me publicly. You demolished my property publicly. You broke federal law publicly. She leaned forward, her voice steady. So if you want this to end here, you're going to own up to it, publicly. Calloway's jaw was so tight I thought his teeth might crack. The graying board member cleared his throat. That might be difficult. Emily shrugged. Then I'll see you in court. The tension in the room skyrocketed. For several seconds, no one spoke. Then, finally, Calloway exhaled sharply, slumping back in his chair. Fine, he muttered. Public apology. We'll draft a statement. Emily smiled. Live press conference. Calloway's eye twitched. You're joking. Do I look like I'm joking? Silence. Calloway glanced at the other board members, but no one backed him up. They knew they had lost. Finally, he rubbed his temples and sighed. Fine. Press conference. But after that, this is over. Emily stood. If you hold up your end of the deal, then yeah, it's over. And just like that, we had won. But what none of us realized, what none of us could have predicted, was that the HOA's worst nightmare wasn't the lawsuit. It was what would happen after the press conference. The press conference was set for Monday morning, right in front of the HOA's pristine clubhouse. A local news crew was already set up by the time we arrived, their cameras trained on the small podium where Calloway and the HOA board would soon stand. I could tell Calloway hated every second of this. His usual arrogance was gone, replaced by a tight-lipped grimace. The other board members looked equally miserable, like they were being forced to swallow a bitter pill. Emily, on the other hand, was calm, confident. She had dressed sharply, her presence commanding, even in her wheelchair. She wasn't just here to hear an apology. She was here to set a precedent. A small crowd had gathered, neighbors, reporters, even a few people from disability rights organizations who had caught wind of the story. I overheard whispers, people muttering about how they had also been mistreated by the HOA. The air was thick with anticipation. Finally, Calloway stepped up to the microphone, clearing his throat. The cameras zoomed in. As president of the HOA, he began, voice stiff, I want to address the events of the past week regarding the removal of an accessibility ramp from the Harper residence. I watched as he gripped the edges of the podium, his knuckles white. This was killing him. We acknowledge that our actions were premature, he continued, carefully choosing his words. The HOA board deeply regrets any inconvenience caused to Ms. Harper and her family. We understand the importance of accessibility and are committed to ensuring that all residents feel accommodated in our community. Emily's lips twitched slightly. Inconvenience. Cute choice of words. Calloway glanced sideways, as if hoping someone would bail him out, but no one did. We will be covering all costs associated with the reconstruction of the ramp, he went on, his voice wooden. Furthermore, the HOA will be reviewing our policies to ensure compliance with federal accessibility laws moving forward. The crowd murmured. He took a deep breath. And then, with visible strain, he forced out the final words. We apologize to Ms. Harper for any distress this situation has caused. I nearly laughed at how painful it was for him to say that. The second he stepped away from the microphone, reporters pounced. Ms. Harper, do you accept the HOA's apology? One of them called out. Emily turned her wheelchair slightly to face the cameras. I appreciate the gesture, she said smoothly, but apologies are meaningless without action. This is about more than just one ramp. It's about holding organizations like this accountable for how they treat people. More murmurs from the crowd. Some nods. Even a few claps. Another reporter raised a hand. Do you plan to move forward with legal action? Calloway shot her a sharp glance, but Emily didn't hesitate. I'm reviewing all available options, she said simply. That was enough to send Calloway into a full-body flinch. He knew, just like I did, that this wasn't over. Not even close. By the time we got home, the press conference was already making waves online. The clip of Calloway's forced apology was circulating fast, with social media ripping the HOA apart. People from all over the country were chiming in, sharing their own HOA horror stories. And then, something even bigger happened. Emily's email pinged. She read the message once, then twice, then let out a low whistle. "What?" I asked, peering over her shoulder. She turned the screen toward me, her eyes gleaming. It was a forwarded letter from the Department of Justice. They were officially launching an investigation into the HOA. "Holy," I started, but Emily just smirked, leaning back in her wheelchair. "This," she said, "is about to get really interesting." By the next morning, the entire neighborhood was buzzing. People who had never given us a second glance were suddenly stopping to say hello, some even thanking Emily for standing up to the HOA. Others were less friendly, particularly Calloway's little circle of loyalists, who shot us dirty looks as we passed. But none of that mattered anymore, because now the feds were involved. Emily wasted no time. She spent the morning gathering every shred of evidence we had, emails, letters, photos of the ramp before and after it was destroyed. Then she started reaching out to other residents, asking if they'd ever been mistreated by the HOA. The responses came flooding in. An elderly couple who had been fined $500 for leaving their trash cans out for 30 minutes past the HOA's designated time. A single mother who had been harassed over her non-compliant front door color, despite half the houses in the neighborhood having the same shade. A disabled veteran who had been denied permission to build a small ramp for his own wheelchair, just like Emily. The more we dug, the uglier it got. And then, right in the middle of compiling it all, something happened that made it very clear the HOA wasn't just going to roll over and accept defeat. Someone tried to break into our house. It happened late that night, just as I was locking up. At first, I thought I imagined it, the faint sound of shuffling near the porch. But then, I saw the shadow. Someone was creeping toward the front of our house, moving low, like they didn't want to be seen. My adrenaline spiked. I reached for my phone, ready to call the cops, but before I could dial, the motion-activated floodlights blasted on, drenching the porch in bright white light. And that's when I saw him. A man in dark clothes, mid-step, frozen like a deer in headlights. Our eyes locked for half a second. Then he bolted. "Hey!" I shouted, throwing open the door, but he was already running. I caught a glimpse of his face as he turned the corner, just enough to recognize him. He was one of Calloway's HOA enforcers. Rage flooded through me. I wanted to chase him, wanted to drag him back and demand to know exactly what he thought he was doing. But then I saw what was in his hand. A can of spray paint. It didn't take a genius to figure out what he'd planned to do. I looked at the porch, the front door, the siding of the house. He hadn't gotten the chance, but I knew he was about to vandalize our home. I stormed inside, my heart still pounding. Emily was already waiting in the hallway, her eyes sharp. What was that? I exhaled hard, running a hand through my hair. One of Calloway's guys tried to spray paint the house. Emily's expression darkened. "Did you get his face?" "Oh yeah," I said grimly. "And so did the security cameras." Emily's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Perfect," she said. "Hey everyone, what would you have done if you caught someone trying to vandalize your house? Let us know in the comments. And if you're loving this story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life drama." The next morning, Emily wasted no time. She sent the security footage straight to the police, along with a formal complaint against the HOA. And that was the moment Calloway and his crew realized they weren't just dealing with a lawsuit anymore. Now, they were dealing with criminal charges. By midday, the police were at our door. 2 officers, serious-faced, stood on our porch as Emily played the security footage on her phone. The video showed everything: the HOA enforcer sneaking toward the house, the can of spray paint in his hand, the exact moment he froze when the floodlights hit him. One of the officers, a broad-shouldered guy named Officer Grayson, nodded grimly as he watched. "That's clear as day," he muttered. "Do you know who he is?" I folded my arms. "Yeah. He's one of Calloway's guys. Works security for the HOA." Grayson exchanged a glance with his partner. Typical intimidation tactic, the other officer muttered. They know they're losing, so they're trying to scare you. Emily's expression didn't change. It's not going to work. Grayson gave a small nod of approval. Glad to hear it. We'll be following up with this guy today. If you're open to pressing charges, we can move on vandalism and attempted property damage. Emily smiled, sharp and satisfied. Oh, I insist on pressing charges. News traveled fast. By that evening, Callaway and the HOA board were in full damage control mode. They sent out a mass email to the neighborhood, claiming they had zero tolerance for misconduct and were fully cooperating with law enforcement. But here's the thing, we weren't buying it. And neither was the community. Something was shifting in the neighborhood. People were starting to talk about their own experiences, about how Callaway and his HOA had abused their power for years. Then, something happened that neither Emily nor I expected. A group of homeowners, at least 20 of them, showed up at our door. It started with a knock. I opened the door, half expecting another unpleasant surprise from the HOA. Instead, I found a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair standing on our porch. Behind him stood a small crowd of neighbors. He cleared his throat. Ms. Harper. Emily rolled forward. Yes. He shifted awkwardly, glancing back at the others before turning back to her. We just wanted to say, thank you. Emily blinked. For what? For standing up to them. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the group. They've been pulling this kind of crap for years, another woman said, stepping forward. We've all been too afraid to fight back. But you, she shook her head in admiration. You're doing what we should have done a long time ago. A younger guy, probably in his early 30s, nodded. We want to help. However we can. I glanced at Emily, expecting her to be surprised. Instead, she looked thoughtful. Then, slowly, a smile spread across her face. Then let's take them down, she said. That night, our living room turned into something out of a crime thriller. Emily sat at the head of the room, laptop open, while neighbors spilled every story, every shady HOA fine, every ridiculous demand Callaway had made over the years. The pattern was undeniable. The HOA had been abusing its power for a long time. Emily took notes, cross-referencing everything with legal statutes. More than half of what they'd been doing wasn't just unethical, it was illegal. Callaway's done, I muttered, shaking my head. Once all this comes out, there's no way he keeps his position. Emily's smile turned razor-sharp. Oh, I'm not just getting Callaway out, she said. I'm dismantling this entire system. And judging by the determined looks in the room, she wasn't alone. The HOA had started this war. But now, the neighborhood was fighting back. By morning, we had a plan. The neighbors had come forward with so much dirt on the HOA that Emily could have built an entire case file just from their testimonies alone. Fines issued without legal backing. Selective enforcement of rules. Financial records that didn't add up. Even one case where a family had been threatened with foreclosure over an unpaid HOA fee that was later proven to be an accounting error. This wasn't just mismanagement. It was corruption. Emily drafted a formal complaint to the state's housing authority, attaching every document, every witness statement, and every legal violation she could find. Then, she reached out to a legal advocacy group that specialized in HOA abuse cases. And just to really turn up the heat, she called in an investigative journalist. By noon, the HOA's worst nightmare had arrived, a news crew. The reporter, a sharp-eyed woman in a navy blazer, set up right in front of the HOA clubhouse, microphone in hand. We're standing outside the Oak Ridge Community Homeowners Association headquarters, where allegations of abuse, financial misconduct, and discrimination are now under investigation, she announced. Residents claim they have been subjected to unfair fines, intimidation, and even illegal property destruction. Cue the footage of our ramp being demolished. Then, interviews with neighbors. And finally, a clip of Emily, cool and composed. The HOA isn't above the law, she said firmly. And it's time they learned that. It was a disaster for Callaway. By that evening, the HOA's inbox was flooded. Their phone lines were ringing off the hook. And worst of all, their biggest fear had come true. People were demanding an audit. That was when the real cracks started to show. The first board member to crack was the treasurer, a nervous-looking man named Donnelly. At first, he had tried to stay silent. But after just one phone call from the state investigator looking into the HOA's finances, he panicked. Then, he did what every guilty person does when they're about to go down. He turned on his own team. Emily got the tip from one of our contacts. That night, as we sat in our living room, she read an email out loud, eyes gleaming with satisfaction. To whom it may concern, I wish to formally report that unauthorized financial transactions have taken place under the direction of HOA President William Calloway. I whistled low. Calloway's own guy just sold him out? Oh, it gets better, Emily said, scrolling down. Donnelly attached bank records. I leaned forward. Wait, you're telling me they weren't just corrupt, they were embezzling? Looks like it. Emily sat back, looking almost amused. Calloway wasn't just fining people unfairly. He was pocketing money from the HOA's accounts. I shook my head in disbelief. How much? From what Donnelly's sent? Emily tapped her screen. At least 50 grand. And that's just what he knows about. I let out a low laugh. Calloway is screwed. Emily grinned. Oh, he has no idea how screwed he is. Because now, this wasn't just a civil case. Now, this was criminal. The next morning, Calloway's world started to collapse. It started with the State Housing Authority launching an official audit of the HOA's finances. Then, local law enforcement got involved, investigating the embezzlement accusations from Donnelly. By noon, Calloway's office door was locked. By 3 p.m., he had deleted the HOA's website and disabled their social media pages. By 5 p.m., he was officially removed as HOA president. But the best part, the police showed up at his house that evening. I was on the porch when I saw it happen, 2 uniformed officers knocking on Calloway's door, hands resting casually on their belts. The moment he opened the door, they started talking, gesturing toward their notepads. Calloway's face turned an unnatural shade of red. His lips moved fast, probably denying everything, trying to wiggle his way out. But then, one of the officers held up a folder. A folder I knew contained the financial records Donnelly had leaked. And just like that, Calloway's shoulders slumped. Emily rolled onto the porch beside me, watching with quiet satisfaction. That, she murmured, is the look of a man who knows he's going to jail. Sure enough, after a few more minutes of arguing, Calloway was led toward the police car. Not in handcuffs yet, but it was clear that this was only the beginning. I let out a slow whistle. Well, that escalated quickly. Emily smirked. Did it, though? She had a point. Calloway had spent years running this HOA like his own personal kingdom. But the moment someone pushed back, really pushed back, his entire empire crumbled in less than a week. And he had no one to blame but himself. By the next morning, Calloway had officially resigned from the HOA board, claiming he needed to focus on personal matters. Translation: he was desperately trying to avoid prison. But it was too late for that. Because just as I was sipping my coffee, scrolling through my phone, I saw the breaking news update. William Calloway, former HOA president, under investigation for financial misconduct. I turned my phone toward Emily, raising an eyebrow. Looks like your plan worked. She glanced at the headline, unimpressed. It's not over yet. She was right. Because as Calloway was scrambling to save himself, the entire HOA board was now in chaos. And next on our list, the ones who enabled him. The HOA board was falling apart. With Calloway out of the picture, the remaining board members had 2 choices: jump ship or go down with him. Some, like Donnelly, had already flipped. Others tried to act like they had no idea what had been going on. But that excuse wasn't going to work anymore. Not with the state audit and a criminal investigation looming over them. By midweek, 2 more board members had resigned. The HOA sent out a pathetic email to the neighborhood, filled with corporate-style nonsense about restructuring and ensuring community trust. Translation: they were desperate to make this go away. But Emily wasn't done with them yet. That afternoon, she called an emergency community meeting. Not the HOA's usual private, board-only meetings. No, this one was for everyone. We booked the local rec center and spread the word fast. By 7 p.m., the room was packed. Homeowners who had been silenced for years now had the chance to speak. One by one, people stepped up. A retired couple shared how they were fined $2,000 for a mailbox that wasn't the correct shade of beige. A young mother explained how she was forced to tear up a garden she planted for her autistic son because it didn't meet community aesthetic standards. A veteran, who had lost a leg in combat, described how the HOA denied his request for a wheelchair-accessible driveway extension. The more people talked, the angrier the crowd became. The HOA had built its power on fear. But now, that fear was gone. And when Emily took the microphone, she drove the final nail into the coffin. "This isn't just about Callaway," she said. "It's about the system that let him get away with it for so long." Murmurs of agreement. "Right now, we have a choice," she continued. "We can keep this broken HOA, let them find another Callaway to take over, or we can take it back." People started nodding. Some clapped. Then, a voice from the back of the room called out, "How do we take it back?" Emily smiled. "I'm glad you asked. By the time we left that meeting, we had something bigger than a lawsuit. We had a movement. People were ready to fight. And now, we were going to vote out the entire HOA board. Let me ask you this. Have you ever dealt with a power-hungry HOA? What did you do about it? Drop a comment below. And if you're enjoying this story, make sure to like and subscribe." The next morning, the HOA board woke up to something they never expected. A formal petition, signed by over 80% of the neighborhood, demanding a recall election. Their reign of terror was officially on the clock. The HOA board was in full panic mode. By noon, we got word that Callaway had lawyered up, likely realizing that the financial investigation wasn't going away. Meanwhile, the remaining board members were scrambling to stop the recall election before it even started. They tried everything. First, they claimed the petition was invalid because it didn't follow some obscure bylaw. Emily shut that down immediately, citing a different bylaw that made the recall process ironclad. Then, they tried intimidation. One of Callaway's old cronies, a board member named Linda Hawthorne, sent out threatening letters to petition signers, warning that rebelling against the HOA could have consequences. Big mistake. Within hours, homeowners were forwarding those letters to Emily, who wasted no time sending them straight to her lawyer and the state attorney general's office. By the end of the day, Linda had resigned. Now, only 3 board members remained, and they were running out of options. The official recall election was set for Friday night. It was going to be a simple vote. Either the board stayed or they were completely wiped out. But in the days leading up to it, the HOA tried one last desperate move. They sent out one final email, dripping with manipulative nonsense. "Dear homeowners, we understand that recent events have caused division within our community. As your HOA, we have always acted with the neighborhood's best interest at heart. While mistakes may have been made, we urge you to consider the importance of experienced leadership in maintaining property values and order. Please think carefully before voting, as the outcome will impact us all." Translation: "We're begging you not to fire us." But the neighborhood wasn't falling for it anymore. Friday night arrived. The rec center was packed. Homeowners, young and old, came out in record numbers to vote. The atmosphere was electric. People were done being pushed around. The HOA board sat at the front table, looking visibly nervous. Callaway wasn't there. He was too busy dealing with his legal problems, but his former allies were pale-faced and sweating. One by one, homeowners lined up to cast their votes. Then, after an hour, the results were tallied. The moderator stepped up to the microphone. "The votes have been counted," he announced, "and the decision is final." A hush fell over the room. The board members up for recall have been removed from their positions, effective immediately. Cheers erupted. People clapped, some even hugged. I turned to Emily, grinning. "You did it." She smiled, but there was still that look in her eye. "This isn't just about getting rid of them," she said. "It's about what happens next. Because now, we were in charge, and the real work was just beginning." The HOA board was officially gone. For the first time in years, the neighborhood was free from their rule. But now, we had to decide what came next. With Calloway and his cronies out, a new board had to be elected. And this time, the right people needed to be in charge. People who actually cared about the community instead of just controlling it. And guess who everyone wanted to lead the charge? Emily. You should do it, I said, leaning against the kitchen counter. Emily didn't look up from her laptop. Not happening. I sighed. Why not? You took down an entire corrupt HOA board. You literally know every law, every bylaw, every loophole they tried to exploit. You'd be perfect for it. Emily finally glanced up. I don't want to run an HOA. I just wanted to fix the mess they created. I smirked. Then fix it from the inside. She didn't answer right away, but I could see the wheels turning in her head. The next night, the entire neighborhood gathered again, this time to elect the new HOA leadership. 3 new candidates had already stepped up, people who had been vocal in the fight against Calloway's regime. But when nominations opened, someone from the back called out, "I nominate Emily Harper." A wave of agreement spread through the crowd. People clapped, nodded, whispered. I glanced at Emily. She sighed, but there was the tiniest smile on her face. So when the moderator asked if she'd accept the nomination, she straightened her shoulders, looked out at the crowd, and said, "I accept." And just like that, the entire room exploded into applause. The votes were counted. When the results were announced, it wasn't even close. Emily had won, by a landslide. She was now the new president of the HOA. But this time, it wasn't about power. It was about justice. And she was about to rewrite the rules. Hey everyone, if you had the chance to take over a corrupt HOA, what would you change first? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you're loving this story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. By morning, Emily got straight to work. The first thing she did? She rolled out a complete overhaul of the HOA's rules. No more ridiculous fines. No more secret penalties. No more selective enforcement. Every decision would be transparent. Every policy would be fair. And that accessibility ramp the HOA had bulldozed? It was already being rebuilt at the HOA's expense. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like an actual community again. Calloway and his crew had spent years treating this place like their kingdom. But now, the people were in charge. And this time, they weren't letting anyone abuse that power ever again. The neighborhood had changed. For the first time in years, people weren't walking around on eggshells, afraid of fines or threats from the HOA. The oppressive grip Calloway had on the community was gone, and in its place was something that actually resembled a neighborhood, one where people looked out for each other instead of being policed by a corrupt board. And at the center of it all, Emily. She wasted no time fixing what Calloway and his cronies had destroyed. The new HOA board, made up of actual residents who wanted fairness, not control, voted on a complete policy overhaul. Gone were the ridiculous fines for minor infractions. Gone were the vague rules that let board members enforce whatever they wanted. Gone was the HOA dictatorship that had made people feel like prisoners in their own homes. Instead, we put in place real protections, especially for people like Emily, the elderly, veterans, and anyone who had been targeted by Calloway's ridiculous rules. And the biggest change? The accessibility ramp that Calloway had so carelessly destroyed? It wasn't just rebuilt. It was improved. The HOA paid for a brand new permanent ramp, one that was sturdier, safer, and completely untouchable by any future HOA board. And just to really drive the point home, Emily had the ADA logo engraved into the wood, a permanent reminder that no one was going to mess with her rights, or anyone else's, ever again. Calloway, on the other hand, well, let's just say things didn't end well for him. The state audit confirmed that he had embezzled over $70,000 from the HOA. He was charged with multiple counts of fraud and financial misconduct. And when his trial finally rolled around, guess who was sitting in the front row, watching as he got sentenced? Emily. When the judge handed down the verdict, guilty, Calloway turned just enough to glance at her. Emily just smiled. Not a smug smile. Not a cruel one. Just the quiet, satisfied look of someone who had done exactly what she said she would do. And as Calloway was led away in handcuffs, she leaned over to me and whispered, "Told you he was going to jail." Months later, the neighborhood was thriving. People had their freedom back. No more arbitrary punishments, no more fear. And Emily, she had officially stepped down as HOA president. Not because she quit. Because she did what she came to do. She fixed it. And now, she was ready to move on. On her last day as HOA president, she rolled out onto the porch, looked at her ramp, and took a deep breath. "Feels different, doesn't it?" I asked, stepping beside her. She nodded. "Yeah, it feels like home." And for the first time since we moved here, it finally was. And that's the end of this wild story. What do you guys think? Did the HOA get what they deserved? Let us know in the comments. And if you loved this story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss our next one. Thanks for watching.